Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dr. John Slattery. I'm the director of the Carl G. Grefenstette Center for Ethics in Science, Technology, and Law here at Duquesne University. Thanks to all of you coming in person, as well as those that are watching us online. I'm really excited for our spring tech ethics discussion today, artificial intelligence and the experience of poverty. So before I introduce the speakers, I just want to talk a little bit about what the Grefenstette Center is, just so you know where we're coming from today. So founded in 2019, the Grefenstette Center takes an unflinching look at the ethical intersections between science and technology in the modern world. So as it says here, we offer a variety of programs and courses and partnerships for students and researchers at Duquesne and throughout the Pittsburgh area and indeed throughout the country, focusing especially on the impact and importance of considering the Catholic faith tradition in this discussion. And that's really what leads us to the topic today. When I think about what aspects of technology you want to highlight from the center, thinking about how it intersects with the Catholic faith and with the Christian faith more generally, this question of poverty and the question of justice really comes to mind. And how do we treat those that are cast aside by society, and how do we heal some of those old wounds, and what role does AI have in this? And these are big questions. There aren't a ton of answers to them, but we bring together people that are all going to have fantastic answers to these very hard questions. And so that's why we wanted to do this today and how it intersects with the Catholic tradition. All right, so just a couple of things here. Our Faculty Scholars program will open up again in May of this year, so next month. This year, for the first time, we're actually going to open this to any faculty from the entire sort of Pittsburgh region. So not just faculty at Duquesne, but throughout the Pittsburgh region. They meet monthly to talk about issues in AI and technology ethics and share their own research and be part of this collaborative environment. Once again, next fall, we're also going to be awarding 4 students an undergrad student research scholarship. So if you're going to be an undergrad here next year, watch for that. These are $2,500 scholarships, and the students are able to participate in these conversations throughout the year. They present at the fall symposium and in the spring hackathon, and there's a lot of really great stuff involved with that. We have a couple of courses in the fall. If you haven't signed up for courses yet, look at these courses, AI Ethics and AI in Healthcare. And then we also have some exciting stuff coming up that I can't fully share yet, but we'll have some new courses next year. The fall 2024 symposium will be going on in October. And then we're also going to have some job openings coming this summer. So we're super excited about all these things to watch out for, to watch our website for. But just wanted to whet your appetite for the things that are coming up. All right, and now to get to the main event today. This conversation today, right, is talking about these big questions you see in front of you, right? Does AI disenfranchise the poor? How has it expanded or shrunk the inequity gap? Can AI be used to make the world more equitable? And to talk about this today, we have 3 fantastic scholars. I'll begin with the author of the book that we're talking about today. The book is called Poor Technology, Artificial Intelligence and the Experience of Poverty, written by Dr. Levi Checkett. Dr. Checketts is an assistant professor of religion and philosophy and the associate director for the Center for Applied Ethics at Hong Kong Baptist University. He has published in Theology and Science, Religions, and the Journal of Moral Theology, among other places, and is also co-editor with Carl Mitchum and Jim Grote of Theology and Technology. He is a networking fellow with AI and Faith and directs the Asian Concerns on AI committee with the Dicastery for Culture and Education Center for Digital Culture at the Vatican. His research primarily lies in the intersection of technology and economic ethics with Catholic theology. And Dr. Checkett also informed me that this is the international book launch for his book, the first time it has been publicly launched outside of Hong Kong. So we are super excited to have that here in Pittsburgh. All right, next we'll have Elonda Clay speak. Elonda is the director of the library at the Methodist Theological School in Ohio. She holds degrees from the University of Missouri, Columbia, Kansas State University, an MTS degree from the Lutheran School of Theology, and an MDiv from the Interdenominational Theological Center. Elonda is the author of a wide variety of essays related to media studies, hip-hop, and U.S. African-American religious thought. and is currently working on a book tentatively entitled Digital Womanism, which focuses on contemporary spiritual and religious digital womanist cultures of Black women, representations and practices related to womanism across digital media, including websites, online discussion forums, blogs, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and probably now TikTok, right? Gonna keep it going. Exactly. All right, and last but certainly not least, Dr. Ehi Nosakhare currently works at Microsoft as a senior applied science manager, leading a team that uses innovative AI solutions to solve complex business and implementation challenges across a variety of Microsoft's products and services, and as she told me before this, including very much so Microsoft's big Copilot initiative, which I'm sure you're all aware of because it pops up on your screen every day. Prior to joining Microsoft, Dr. Nosakhare completed her doctoral training at MIT, where her dissertation focused on how to use interpretable machine learning models to understand behavioral influences on subjective well-being. She has received numerous awards for her research work, which has been featured at a number of conferences. She graduated with a bachelor's from Howard University and an SM and PhD from MIT. She was, just until recently, a director of the Board of Women in Machine Learning and a board member at the Octet Collaborative, a Christian study center at MIT dedicated to human flourishing. So please join me in welcoming our speakers today. All right, and we will start with Dr. Checketts. The floor is yours.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you, most of all, to Dr. Slattery for inviting me for this book launch. As he said, this is my first launch outside of Hong Kong, so I'm very excited to be here. I'm originally from, if you can tell from the accent, I'm originally from the States, and I've been working in Hong Kong for a few years, and it's always good to be back. To begin with, I want to bring up, I think it's appropriate given what's going on today in this city. We have President of the United States here to reflect on something that I've been thinking about or had been thinking about, and I bring up in my book with the previous president, with Donald Trump. When people in the media wanted to criticize President Trump, many times what they focused on were things that weren't related to his moral behavior, or they didn't frame it that way. People said that Donald Trump was a poor man's idea of a rich man. People said that Donald Trump was an idiot. People said that Donald Trump was really not as rich as he said he is. People said that Donald Trump was crazy or that he had dementia. Now, the question is, why did they say these things? Why did they say these things? And what I want you to think about is why these images. They wanted to say Donald Trump was not fit or that to be president or that he was doing a bad job. Why did they say these things in particular? And it gives us a sense of the way that our language we use every day informs a lot of the assumptions we make about what's good and bad. And so to say Donald Trump is a poor man's idea of a rich man or Donald Trump is really not that rich is to say that being rich or being a rich man's idea of a rich man is good. Being mentally fit in a certain definition is good. Being intelligent is good. Being not having senility, not having dementia is good. And Donald Trump was not. So this is not to make a big political statement. It's to note, how did people who wanted to criticize him speak about him? And what does this say about our preconceptions, our biases inherent in the language we use? This is pertinent for the language of artificial intelligence. Right? Why are we talking about intelligence? What's the idea here? Noreen Hertzfeldt, who is one of the leading theologians writing on AI, she wrote a book 20 years ago now. It's probably the first book on theology and AI called In Our Image. And the idea of in our image is that human beings are made in the image of God, and AI is made in our image. Now, the question I want to ask is, whose image is the our that she's talking about when we talk about AI? Because I don't think, and I don't think she would, and she would probably agree with this, I don't think the image that is articulated is everybody's image. The work that I've produced that I wrote. I don't know how good it is, but this thing here. This was a process of trying to think through many different things going on, trying to make sense of AI, trying to make sense of the perspectives it articulates, and trying to figure out where I fit in the conversation. I must note there have been a lot of very good studies of AI and some of the failures, the biases that are articulated in the construction of AI. There's great work by many critical thinkers in the field, and they show that for all the good that it can do, it has some strong limitations. But the question I want to ask with this book is, what beyond these particular specific failures, and we can note, when we have facial recognition that fails to recognize black people, when we have facial recognition that fails to recognize women, these kinds of things we try to fix. But what is the broader idea of AI? What is the broader worldview that it represents? AI in the last decade has shown itself to be extremely tied to economic development, especially accumulation of capital. You may or may not know, AI is not actually that new. It's 75 years, around 70 years old now. The idea, the term artificial intelligence was coined in 1956, so it's quite old, in fact. And for the most part, most of it was done in universities. And for most of the history, it was not a very profitable industry. But in the last decade, it's been tied to a lot of economic forecasts and interests, even in communist China, where they've earmarked a trillion yuan to develop AI through the end of the decade. And they see this as part of the solution for China's economic prosperity. So when we look at AI and we look at the direction it's going, we have to know that there's a lot of moneyed interest, and there's a lot of economic interest. This is not surprising, I think, because AI has this tendency to view the world in terms of numbers, and there's nothing more numerical than money, right? The data that you have to program into AI, the way that you create formulas and algorithms, it's all a matter of mathematics and data. The assumptions that tend to go with contemporary AI constructions are that the world can be turned into data, that efficiency, mathematical efficiency, is better than inefficiency, that technology will solve world's problems, intelligence can be quantified, intelligence is correlated to mathematical proficiency, and intelligence is ideal choice selection, so that when somebody chooses something that may not be, in the long run, for their benefit, then they are not intelligent. AI is designed to do all of these things. I think then the AI demonstrates a certain perspective which is represented by, or is the views of their researchers. Many of their researchers embed their views into AI, and there's an omission of the diversity of understanding, of human experience, of human perspectives. Again, a lot of research currently has explained that there has been a lack of diversity. I think that this diversity can help us to understand, as we challenge the narrative, what humanity means and what we can bring to the table. So this book is my case. It's only my case. That sounds really selfish, doesn't it? It's only meant to be a contribution to the broader conversation. I don't assume that my perspective on things, my contribution, will resound universally. In fact, I assume certainly that my experience does not correlate with most AI researchers. I assume that my experience, especially as a white man, will not correlate with people of color, with women, with LGBTQ folks. And so I don't want to say that my view is going to be the only view. But I do think that if we ask this question of whose view is omitted, we can get a better understanding. So what I bring here is my experience as a child, mostly, of growing up in poverty, first world poverty, but poverty nonetheless. And as I've been thinking about what I experienced and what it was like and how I saw the world as a child, I came to realize an important thing is that the epistemology of the poor is different from the epistemology of the rich and the middle classes. The way the poor understand the world is different. The way they experience and navigate the world is different. And it's hard to understand this because education, our educational systems, our institutions, our universities are framed with this master discourse. We want people to change their understanding. We want to transform young people to have a different understanding. But what is the understanding? It is the understanding of those who are in power. Education, epistemology, to be a certain frame. Now, this isn't necessarily bad to change people's epistemology, but it does mean that it's very hard to go back to where you were before, to understand the world the way that you might have understood it before. You can see this in very simple ways, the way grammar is corrected when you're in primary school, the way that you are taught to think about questions in a different way or construct stories or make decisions about business and life and so forth. What I want to argue then is that, let me give you another example. If you think about in your own classes, and if you're an instructor, you can think about this as well. The way that art is incorporated into classes, into lectures, into the curriculum, which artists and what forms of art, it usually tends to be classical art or art that has a high value. It's not often popular art. And if it is, it feels a little bit cheap. Even the students might find it a little strange to include. Why is this the case? It's because education tends to have a view that there's legitimate art, there's legitimate taste, and there's illegitimate art. So we want people to develop this taste in education. We want them to develop these ideas, this way of thinking. The poor then have to learn how to adapt. If you're going to succeed in education, you have to learn how to think like the upper classes. That's simply how it is. If you don't learn how to think like the upper classes, you won't succeed. And the poor generally have to learn how to appeal to the interests of the upper classes. They have to learn how to speak the language that their listeners will want to hear. They have to appeal to the interests of those who hire them or who will give aid to them. They have to appear grateful. When we think about this issue, then we ask the question from a Catholic perspective of what is the preferential option for the poor. It complicates our understanding because we think the poor, if we want to adopt the perspective of the poor, we have to ask whose perspectives are not being included, whose views are not being adequately articulated, and how do we really get to the ideas of the poor. In doing this work, I found some very interesting studies about how poverty is articulated by people of goodwill, including educators, but also how the poor have had to represent themselves to people giving aid, such as in the 1920s and 40s, through 40s, Archbishop of Dublin, in the state of Indiana, the state of Indiana, in other places, university systems and libraries and so forth. But in a capitalist society where cash is king, the poor, being poor, is a disvalue. It's bad. It's correlated with a failure somehow. And we often think then the people who are poor are deserving of this somehow, that they deserve their fate. Those who are rich are seen as good. They earn their position. They deserve what they have. And again, then we go to the question of why do they speak of Donald Trump this way? Because to be rich means to be deserving of your richness. To be poor is to be deserving of your poverty. So when we think about this, when we consider this, AI, which has its goal, making people wealthy, making the country of China wealthy, making companies wealthy, making our industries, our communities wealthy, making individuals wealthy, it's anti-poor. It's anti-poor because it's constructed in a way that articulates the world in terms of numbers, in terms of profit, in terms of efficiency. And as such, when we talk about the humanity of AI, and a lot of conversations talk about human rights or according to AI a certain moral dignity, it usually assumes a model of humanity that is deeply exclusive. To assume that whatever AI is, the model that AI is what humanity is, means that anything that is not like AI. Anybody who doesn't think like AI, anybody whose moral system or perspective is not like that of AI, is not as human as AI. And this, I think, is the overall concern I have. AI has great promise, has great potential, has great use. It is, in fact, a very, very useful technology. But if we think of it as human, then those who are not like AI will tend not to be seen as human. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Levi. Elonda, it's to you.
Good afternoon. I want to start by asking you a question. Mainly, how were you introduced to the technologies of the future? For me, it was Star Trek, and also the Jetsons. For you, it might have been Futurama. How about Terminator? Or maybe Blade Runner. So keep that thought in mind. How were you introduced? We're going to come back to it. First, I want to say thank you to Dr. Slattery for inviting me to be part of this conversation. And I am very honored and excited to have this opportunity to engage in the conversation around AI and poverty. Dr. Checkett's book, Poor Technology, is in and of itself an accomplishment. Like Dr. Checkett, I found Ian Barber's book, Ethics in an Age of Technology, and volumes 1 and 2 of Theology and Technology, Essays in Christian Ethics, over 20 years ago. And even when I found them, they were old. But what I really noticed about these books was that they didn't have any mention of poverty. And the poor were not really a topic of conversation. So the need for theological studies of technology and the development of theological and moral ethics of AI are beyond overdue. So what that means is Dr. Checkett's book is the new. And we are all up here now to begin to wrestle, to have this beautiful struggle, so to speak. So I want to begin by talking about the social context of poverty. At its core, poverty represents a distinctive mode of existence, which is characterized by a pervasive sense of insecurity and marginalization. It's not merely the absence of wealth, but a fundamentally different way of navigating the world. For the poor, each day is a battle against systemic inequalities and structural barriers that hinder access to basic necessities and opportunities for advancement. Most people think that all librarians do is read books. This couldn't be further from the truth. As a public librarian, it provided me with the opportunity to see the impacts of poverty in real time. You see, even when cities or small towns say they don't have a homeless problem, the unhoused often end up in the library. When they need to use technology, they end up in the library. And so I see them struggling with what does this technology mean and how can it be applicable for my life and my struggles. So I want to talk a little bit about what is called in critical literature as AI empire. Now, this is a fairly new framework. but it tries to deal with advanced technological capitalism. And it looks at the relationships between technology, capitalism, and poverty. Some of these frameworks you're already familiar with, like when I first became a librarian, Colin Powell talked about digital apartheid or technological apartheid. We also often discuss it in terms of the digital divide. And during those moments, there were narratives that said there were groups of people that would never be able to get on the information highway, right? This is how old this is, the beginnings of the internet. So you can notice that there are these types of narratives, as Dr. Checketts points out, that follow with the expectations of what, or rather the limitations of what poor people can do when it comes to technologies. So by centering the experiences of marginalized communities, as you can see within this diagram, it really basically talks about how we have to take into account the roots of AI, which include colonialism and patriarchy, right, and racial capitalism. Like, we can't divorce the development of AI from some of these practices that we have now, such as containment and surveillance, also extractivism. So in that sense, it's giving you a lens that you could look at how social context is impacting poverty. And then finally, when we're dealing with social context, looking contextually at how theology is approached, we need to think about how do these structural sins, what are they for your particular context? It certainly is different for the United States than it is in Brazil and in the continent of Africa. So in that sense, poverty is not just one fits all. You definitely do have to take context into consideration. Now I want to just touch on the world that AI promises, as Dr. Checketts mentioned, or what I'd like to say is forever and ever, and ever and ever, and ever and ever, AI. So when we look at the techno-utopian fantasies of AI, what are the moral implications? One of these techno-utopian fantasies is about automated care, which is a robot that is geared towards older people. It gives them the assurances of both physical and emotional care. And then there are many other applications that are being created. Amazon's Alexa also perpetuates these fantasies by claiming to enhance our lives with ease and enjoyment. However, some of these techno-utopian visions not only seek to automate daily tasks, but also reflect deeper desires to remove people of color from service roles and thereby maintaining a sense of moral purity and whiteness. Now, I want to touch on these images for a moment. I found these images when I was looking at the ways in which the agricultural industry is going to evolve with AI. So the racial politics of robotics, even the term robot in itself, the Czech meaning of the word is worker or slave, highlighting the inherent connection between robotics and colonial race relations. Despite the whitewashing of humanoid robots with white plastic covering, the underlying image of white folk as slaveholders persist. So in this sense, we need to not only look at the context, but also look at these representations. So finally, I just want to say a little bit about how we approach a hermeneutic. No, I'm sorry, I want to talk about the techno-mirror. There we go. Okay, the techno-mirror is a term that comes from the theologian Phil Hefner. And it basically is his talk about what reflections do we see of ourselves in AI. So one of the things that we see is ourselves. So AI reflects our collective values, our aspirations, and our moral dilemmas. However, this reflection is not neutral. It is imbued with our cultural biases, with power dynamics, historical legacies, and normative ideas that privilege a bourgeois conscience. Technology is not merely a tool, but a form of action that shapes our imagination and values. So using this metaphor of the techno-mirror really gives us a compelling understanding of the complex interplay between humanity and AI. And I think I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you so much, Elonda. Ehi?
Thank you so much, Elonda, and thanks, Dr. Checkett, for writing this really good book, and thank you for having me as well. Elonda, your question was really apt. Like, my opening line sort of like answers your question. Like, this is not exactly how I was introduced. However, my first foray into AI, or more narrowly ML or machine learning, was as a grad student. And at the time, I was investigating sort of how are we able to understand whether or not we can see brain injury from the heart, right? Like, so if you imagine if you have a patient who has a brain injury, are you able to detect that through the electrical activity of the heart? And my approach at the time was biomedical signal processing, and it was one-dimensional signal, and it became a very, very complicated problem, a lot harder than I imagined when I started. And at the time, the more I looked into my work or my research, the more I realized that, okay, I couldn't just look at one aspect of this. I needed to combine multiple other signals and data. And there was this interesting thing called machine learning that had started to pop up often in my conversations with other fellow graduate students as well as faculty at MIT. And that was sort of how I got introduced to machine learning. And I've been in that space ever since, or AI now, as it's more broadly called. And since then, I've worked on various applications in AI, both as a researcher, now as a technologist at Microsoft. And I really have been amazed at how much it has enabled in our society. Back to my PhD, and I spent a lot of time, because I was in medical, working on medically related research, working with doctors, using their data from their hospitals and trying to understand a lot of how AI can improve healthcare. And that actually forced me to ask very critical questions of myself, because no longer are these data points just merely data points, right? It was a blood pressure reading from a patient or someone's blood oxygen saturation. And you start to think really critically about, what do these numbers mean? How do you interpret these outputs? What are these models actually doing on the inside? And since then, this has really, made me think really critically about my work, and not just like how do you interpret your work and things like that, but like what exactly am I creating, am I enabling, and how do I ensure that what it is that I'm doing is for the betterment of society. Now, the conversation around the responsible development of AI as well as AI ethics have become a little bit more mainstream within the tech space, and rightfully so, because I do believe that as technologists, like, we should be responsible for what we are creating and enabling, and how that affects society at large. And some of those conversations really started from, how do we make models a lot less, hopefully, a lot less biased. How to make them more interpretable and things like that. And they're now even more broadly into the ethics of AI and, how can we mitigate or prevent some of the broader harms that can come as a result of this technology, especially technologies like generative AI, especially as these models have become a little bit more black box. In my work, I have definitely seen how AI has unlocked productivity or improved productivity or unlocked several segments of society. But I'm also aware of some of the harms that can be created. For example, bias in hiring or, policing, especially when these technologies are being adapted without a lot of like careful thought or review and things like that. And as someone who has spent a lot of time, actively creating this technology and seeing its limitations, and there are a lot of it, but also its potential, I'm very much, excited, I would say, to continue to, I'm very much excited that these conversations around the ethical use or development of AI is becoming more mainstream. And today in particular, I'm really excited about and looking forward to our conversations around how the experience of poverty intersects with AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ehi, and to Levi and Elonda as well. That was a really great opening of our conversation. Now, if anybody new joined us, make sure you go and put your name down to register to win a free book afterwards before I forget, if you haven't done that yet. Okay, so be thinking about your questions. I'm going to kick us off, though. So Levi, I'm going to direct the first one at you. One of the things that really jumped out to me about this book, so the book goes through a lot of different pieces. It goes through a lot of how we understand machine learning and artificial intelligence. How do we understand poverty in general? How does it interact within our society? And then it comes sort of at the end talking about these intersections and what does it mean to create technology that is reflection of perhaps sort of the upper middle class or the upper class. Perhaps it's a reflection of the mostly white male creators in Silicon Valley. And how do we deconstruct and push against that, right? So this is all things that it does. But at the end of the book, I'd say it gets pretty critical of the sort of world of machine learning and AI. And in some of the ways, I think it pushes that criticism to an extent that makes it really hard to sort of come back from, to say, well, if we're not including people in poverty at every step of the creation of AI, we can't ever really be saying to be including these voices from people in poverty, and we're always going to be in this, what I might call theologically, this structure of sin that we're sort of into right now. So I want to ask you about that, Levi, and ask you in sort of from a practical point of view, right? From things that can happen in the near and here and now, sort of balancing that approach with maybe a slightly different approach to say, okay, what can people do, whether or not they're in the field of machine learning, based upon what we're doing right now, or is the answer to really that, like, there is no hope in how we're doing it right now. We have to sort of imagine this whole other world. So I want to start with that sort of pushing there.
Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you should be good.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the passage that John is referring to, I asked this question Given that we're looking at all of this data that has been accumulated through social media, big data, corporate, investments and so forth, it's highly tied to capitalistic goals of the aughts and early 2010s. And given the machine learning goals of efficiency of capital production and so forth, and given all of these things, how could we actually produce an AI that could be poor in a kind of strong sense? Like, it's for the poor, it's of the poor, it's by the poor. And I do a thought experiment to try to think through this, right? Every step of the way, you would want to include the poor and make it for the poor, by the poor, of the poor. And so first of all, you need a goal set by the poor. So it can't be a goal of just maximizing capital for a corporation. It's got to be something much more of interest to actual poor populations. Secondly, you got to get funding for that. Well, that's going to be a hard task immediately, right? Because people who provide funding usually want return on investment, which means they want capital, which is going to go against the goals to start from the beginning. So you have to get some kind of funding that cannot be tied to expectations of return on investment. Otherwise, you're back into this capitalist mode of thinking. Then you've got to get data collected by the poor. And that's going to be difficult to do because they've got to both provide the data and select the data, what they want to articulate and how they articulate it. And you've got to try to do this without coercing them into providing the data that you want them to provide. It's got to be data that they decide that they want to provide. And then, in the end, you've also got to have poor programmers who can figure out the relevance of data and the significance for the goal. But the problem with that is you've got to pay them, which means it gets back into the structure of capitalism. Because if you don't pay them, then it's exploitative. And if you pay them, then they're going to do it for the goal of achieving a certain economic end. And so through all of this, you've got many obstacles which just tie into the goal of capitalism. So, but assuming you can do this, assuming you could do this, you could have a poor AI. But it would still be something that has a specific goal, a specific function. And that leads to the question of will it be done? Can it be done? Is it feasible? And I wonder. But I think when we ask this question, we recognize that you can't easily get out of it, and then you shouldn't delude yourself into thinking you can get out of it. If we say like, oh, this is an example that was taken from a book from Virginia Eubanks. She studied the late aughts, state of Indiana, Governor Mitchell, I think. Mitch Daniels, that's what his name. He tried to automate their welfare system. And the idea was to, make this so that it would help all of the Hoosiers, it'd be beneficial to everybody. It's going to cut waste, and it's going to save taxpayers' money. It's all good things to strive for, but it was disastrous. And people who were on welfare lost their welfare access because the system was imperfect. And it tried to detect cheaters more than it tried to enable people to access welfare, because that was the goal. The reason why they made it automated was to make it so that they could get rid of the human element. Those social workers with bleeding hearts who might see people who are poor as deserving of aid instead of trying to figure out who's cheating and who's not. And people actually died because they couldn't access their health benefits, so they couldn't access adequate nutrition. And eventually it was scrapped it was a disaster, and they blamed the technology. They didn't blame the people who were creating this program. They blamed the technology. So I think if we can be aware that all of these programs have these goals in mind, that they don't inherently recognize humanity, that they're meant for efficiency, for profit maximization. If we can be honest about that, we can not solve the problem, but we can recognize it where it pops up. And so if we want to ask the question, how do we articulate the option of the poor? How do we fulfill the option of the poor? We're going to see that technology, especially capitalist funded technology is not the solution. And so I don't think we're damned. I'll say that. I don't think we're inherently lost. But I do think we have to be honest in our conversations. We have to be willing to say AI is very, very useful. And the problem is it's very useful. And sometimes we need to be attentive to things that are not useful, right? Because in all of this conversation, the poor are devalued because they're considered not useful. I don't know how many times I've read articles that talk about laborers, low-wage laborers as not high value producing laborers, which is nonsense when you look at economics. But that's the way we talk about the poor. It's the way we talk about the working class. And so if we can be real about the fact that AI is very useful, then we can start talking about the importance and value of non-useful people, non-useful things, non-useful goals, non-useful ideas. Sometimes it's okay to waste. It's better to waste our dollars on those who are not deserving than to cut those who are deserving off.
Thank you. Ehi, I just want to throw this to you. And I know, I think I want to ask about the reasons for making AI, right? I mean, you talked about this in your graduate work, and I mean, it seems like it was a really, wanted to solve the sort of complex sort of medical issues, and I know a lot of people in the AI field. I don't think everyone's just there to make a quick buck, nor do I think that's the primary goal. But I mean, I just want to hear sort of from your perspective, and sort of responding to Levi a little bit, what do you see as the reason for creating these things and the reason for putting these tools out there in the world?
That's a very good question. Why do we create AI? I think more broadly, why do we create any form of technology?
Wait, can you click the button on your thing? I'm sorry.
Am I on now?
There we go.
Yeah,
Thank
perfect. I was saying that's a very good question, right? Why do we create AI? Or even more broadly, why do we create any form of technology, right? Oftentimes is, you see a problem and you feel like there's a way you can do it a little bit more efficiently. And then you go ahead and create the tools to do these a little bit more efficiently. And I think that's ultimately somehow how, this, creation of AI started, right? It's hard to imagine that there's someone out there has this intention of initial evil intention of, oh, let's create this for blah, 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 right? Yes, do these technologies eventually cause harms? And, to Dr. Checkett's point, maybe disenfranchise certain populations, yes. However, I do think on the onset, oftentimes is maybe a little bit more efficient, sometimes being a little bit more productive, sometimes to make quick bucks, right? And that's also very valid. We live in a capitalist society. So depending on who the player is, and and yes, we do talk about AI like this, broad thing, right? But AI, is a group of several applications, and depending on what application you're referring to within AI, I do believe there are different reasons that one can use to create it.
Mm-hmm. Elonda, throwing this question to you, and this will be the last one, and then I'll ask the audience for some good questions here. You brought up a lot of really powerful points, in your response, and one of those I want to double down about was sort of that question of AI empire, because that seems to say, okay, it's good to talk about poverty, but it's only one part of this larger web of societal injustices that we have to take into account when we're building this technology. And I guess the question, and we talked about this a little bit earlier today, the question is, how do we differentiate the fact that these are simply in society and whether or not they're unique to technology, right? So is it about solving them in technology, or is it about solving them in society and then hoping that sort of trickles into the technology we're creating? As a Christian theologian, how do you see that sort of practical application of some of these really challenging structures?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking of the social shaping of technology. And so my immediate answer would be that you have to do both simultaneously, they both have to happen. You can't say, well, I'm going to focus on this societal inequalities, and I'm not going to include technology because for the most part, our social systems are digitized. Our social services are digitized. So one of the things that we did talk about was that if you don't have digital literacy, you're automatically excluded from a lot of the services you could get because you don't have the skills to overcome it. Now, you could get assistance with that, but at the same time, technologists normally design and create technologies without thinking of certain groups. I'll say one example of this is older people, right? Older people are technology consumers, but they're randomly marketed too. And definitely when the technology is designed, it's not designed with them in mind. For example, to take into account that they may have technology hesitancy, to take into account that they may or may not have access, that they may or may not have literacy. So these are the challenges that the technologists could take into consideration, either by maybe having a user profile or having a focus group, having something to say to this end user. I'm going to take you, you need to be a part of this process rather than just somehow society is going to take care of all of the inequalities that exist.
No, that's great. I have so many more questions, but I'm going to pause my questions and open it up here. Dr. Ercan Avci here is a postdoc for the center. So any questions here? Looks like we have to start right here.
Hi.
And if you could just start with your name and where you're coming from.
Hi. So I'm Ren. I'm the program manager for the Department of Catholic Studies here. And I guess my question is really for everyone, particularly for Dr. Checkett, but I think for everyone. So I grew up below the poverty line, and I grew up in the foster care system. And so I feel like I've got a pretty good grip on some of that base level of what it means to be poor in America. And I have a hard time understanding and before I came to Duquesne, I worked for one of Pittsburgh public schools that has a tremendous poverty level. It was one of the schools that basically every kid during COVID had to also receive a hotspot because they had no internet in their homes, much less computers. I mean, it's just, And I just struggle. So I guess when I think of AI, I think of like big, shiny, fancy things. And I tend to think of high upper class solutions for upper class problems. And I really struggle to understand when you talk about a poor AI and you talk about an AI created by the poor and for the poor and that would have applications for the poor, I'm like digging into my own experience and I just can't figure out how AI would have helped me or the kids like me or the kids I grew up with. Like, poor problems tend to be really human problems. They are abuse, neglect, poverty, like all these things, right? So like, what is AI gonna come in and do? Much less the barrier with technology where it's like, who even has a computer? Like even if AI could create a program that would, I guess I could have seen like education, like I wasn't provided a good education, so I could have seen like, maybe that's a place I could have been helped, but then you have all of these other things that you can't even take for granted. So yeah, I would love to know what in a dream world where you have a poor AI for the poor and from the poor, what are these applications that could benefit the poor in the first place? Or is AI really something for millionaires?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of what you're asking is like who's got access and who's using it. And I do tend to agree with you. I don't see this as something any way in the near future being really something that'll be in the hands of the poor. I mean, you have like those free generative AI tools. You You can use, make images and such, but that's not really useful, right? It can help you cheat your way through school, I guess, right? Maybe that'll be helpful.
And free versions are terrible.
That's true too, right? That's true. But more generally, for example, social programs. This is one of the big goals of government funding of AI. They want to use it for social programs. Again, I mentioned the Indiana context, but there's a lot of cases that people have studied where it's been used for policing, for example, and often in very bad ways. But let's say you wanted to use it to help with integration of felons back into the community, right? To reduce recidivism. Let's say reduce recidivism. This is a goal that actually a lot of people can get on board with, not just poor communities, but also rich people because they don't want to pay so much money for taxes and so forth, though that's questionable, I guess, right? But let's say that's the goal. We could actually then say, what will be the ways to help people actually not go back into the system? And that's where you have to ask poor communities. You can't just use your own assumptions because, as we see in the United States, we have one of the highest recidivism rates in the world, and whatever we're doing is not working, right? So we can ask the poor to provide their suggestions, their solutions. We can use data from poor communities where there are community-based solutions, where there's grassroots organizations. And this is, I think, and this is actually the case that I give in the book. If we start thinking this way, we might see a way to develop it, but it's still going to have this tie into, at some point, capitalism, and that's where you're going to end up. At some point, the Department of Justice, for example, is going to want to see results, and if the results are not what they expect, you might lose funding, and that's where it comes back to this problem that it's still stuck in the logic of capitalism. So I think there is a potential for use. But again, I want to say this is usefulness, efficiency, and there's an inherent question about what are those things that are not deemed useful in society. And so there I think there's going to be less possibility for the poor.
I tend to think more positively about even the use of commercial AI in terms of specifically supporting survival. And also, for example, I was looking at the ways in which Twitter was used in terms of different organizing, like specifically digital organizing and protests. You could say this was a use of technology, an unexpected use of technology by marginalized and oppressed groups, which worked for a while until, I would say until billionaires figured out it's better to own the platform. And that's the way that you really get rid of or silence your critics. So I think that poor people in particular do adopt technologies differently, and they do find use for it in terms of enriching their quality of life. Now, will that be, it's not earth-shattering perhaps, but it could make a real difference. So yeah.
I like to think about it as starting from the problem, right? What exactly is the problem and how can that be solved? To your point, a lot of poor people's problems are human problems. And while I think AI is an excellent technology, you actually encounter it a lot more than you realize in everyday life. I don't think it's the solution for everything, right? And then it becomes this hammer and the nail problem, right? Because you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That is sometimes what we run into when AI starts getting pulled in to solve some of these really challenging societal problems. So I think for me, it's the pause and really asking, yes, do we really need poor AI, or do we just want to solve poverty in the best way possible, with or without the use of AI? And of course, if it turns out that yes, AI is the best solution for this, then this is where, you know, I start to think about representation, right? Like, who are the people who are going to be affected by this technology? What do they really want? How can we create it in a way that their voices are being reflected, right, all the way through? And this is a problem, and it's challenging, right? Because, you know, in order for you to create AI, and hopefully it becomes a lot more democratized, right? You know, you require, you know, what is required is a certain knowledge, certain, you know, educational level, like, you know, access to certain technologies, compute, things like that. That makes it really challenging and really difficult to bring as many people as possible to the table. But the hope is that as the technology continues to progress, and hopefully people become a little bit more, I guess, open, we can start to bring in different voices, different people. And it's starting to happen, I believe. Maybe we're not there yet, but I do believe there's progress from when AI started to where we are now. Like, we have a lot more people who have access to this technology, who can use it, who can create it, versus when this started.
Thank you so much. Next question.
It's on. Is it on? Yeah. Okay. This is sort of circling back to the capitalism point. Which,
Sorry, can you say your name again?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Lauren Sugden. I'm a professor in the math department. So I find the point really compelling that technology and AI in particular are fully wrapped up in what is you know, pretty intense brand of capitalism in this country. And I think in general, like that has a huge effect just on how incentives work in this country. And I think that's a huge problem. But I guess what I'm wondering is if you, and this might be a hard question, but do you have examples from other societies that are maybe have, I don't know if there are societies around the world that are like fully detached from capitalism, but maybe some that are you know, not quite our brand, where the integration of technology into society works differently, or I don't know if there are any differences that exist in the world that we can look at as examples.
I feel like I live in such a society to some degree. Hong Kong is now part of China, so we're a special autonomous region, administrative region, sorry. So we have different laws, but a lot of funding, a lot of control, a lot of interests are tied to the mainland. It's an interesting question, though, because even though, you know, Mao Zedong wanted to make China the most communist country, his successors kind of changed it. So, you know, Deng Xiaoping articulated socialism with Chinese characteristics. You might have heard this phrase, socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's a term used by Deng Xiaoping, which was opening up the economy, in fact, so that there are special economic zones in China where it's much more capitalistic. One of those is a city just north of Hong Kong, right across the border, Shenzhen. It was, when it became a special economic zone, it was a relatively small city of, as I say this thinking in the US context, it's not that small, but it was only about 300,000 people. Today it is 18 million people, one of the biggest cities in China. It doesn't have a minimum wage. It doesn't have the same economic regulations as other parts of China. And because of that, a lot of companies have set up factories there. So it's mostly well known for being electronics manufacturing center of the world. And most famous probably for Foxconn having their plants there. And so there's been some, you know, anyway, this is part of the China is not as communist as it potentially could be. But because it is a communist society, there's also a lot of control. And so the use of AI for China has been largely social control, not specifically capitalistic. I mean, there is that, as I mentioned before. It's seen as now, in the 13th five-year plan, it was articulated as the new strategy because manufacturing development growth has been slowing down in China. And so to help spur the economy more, they see AI as a solution. But it's also tied into the social credit system. And now I just heard from one of my colleagues, they are beginning to not just use facial identifiers, but also trying to collect genetic data from all the members of the country. So this is not strictly speaking capitalistic, but it is certainly trying to reinforce a certain power dynamic, power hierarchy. I think the question you may be asking then is, are there examples of AI empowering people, liberating people, AI for democratic purposes? And I think that's a good question. And I think there are people who are working on this, but they're fighting uphill battles in most places.
Hi, my name is Natalie. I'm a senior here at Duquesne. So I know we talked about it in a class with Dr. Slattery, how policing AI systems often tend to go towards certain areas, for example, like areas that are more so African American populated or something like that. And I was just wondering if that happens for poverty too, and if that's the case, how do you change that even though that's the data that's presented, and even though it might have been that 10 years ago and that's the data, how do you change it to today to change the bias of the AI systems?
So you mean in specific locations?
Yeah.
Well, I think the issue, it's much harder to like we have better data about locations and poverty because of incomes, reported incomes, and taxes and such. So, for example, I used to live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and Oakland was known for a long time being a poor area, right, and having a lot of poverty. But as incomes rose in first Silicon Valley, and then a lot of people working in Silicon Valley moved into San Francisco, and people in San Francisco who could no longer afford to live there moved to Oakland, this right gentrification. The cost of living and the sort of economic level of Oakland rose. So then people who were living in Oakland were displaced into other communities like San Leandro. And so we can actually track, what's going on. You could use AI to track how income levels are changing. But it's, we typically have tax records from year to year, which help us to see which areas are poor, which areas are no longer poor.
Ehi, you mind if I point this sort of question to you? It's sort of make it a little more general about training data in general.
Yes, yeah,
Like
that
how
was
do you,
going to be my response.
yeah, like how do you work with training data? What does that look like for you?
To start off, I think, we know, right? Like AI is powered by data, and data is collected in society and would always be a reflection of society, including the ills of society. And to your specific case in terms of how do you reduce bias in AI, a lot of it starts from the data that you collect, right? If you think about, one, who's collecting the data, where is it being collected, what are their, intentions, right? And you start to see how and why bias gets crept in. Oftentimes, and I'm hoping things are changing, right? You don't really have, especially in research, like in the early stages of AI research, you're not really having very careful study design, right? Like, okay, this is the problem I'm trying to solve. Maybe this is what the data needs to look like. This is how the data needs to be curated, and so on and so forth. So that doesn't always happen, and it probably should, right? You're really just gathering, because now the models, especially because they can ingest a lot of data, you're just gathering as much data as you can possibly get in order to make your model a bit more accurate or a bit more representative. So in that sense, with training data, right, maybe a little bit more thought needs to be put into like what kind of data are you training? And that's also where bias creeps in. There's also the role that the technologist plays. To answer Dr. Slattery's question a little bit more specifically, in a very simple case, assuming I want to predict, let's say, house prices in a region, right? I would collect data, maybe, in this particular area, how often were houses sold prior, who was selling the homes, what are the profile of people who own the homes, are the old homes, what does it look like, things like that, right? And then when I have that data, I start to clean it or create features out of that data based on what I think would be a bit more predictive of house prices in the region. And at that point, right, whatever it is I'm creating is accurately reflecting my perspective on what I think is predictive of house prices in this particular region. And yes, of course, predicting house prices maybe is not really a problem, but once you start thinking about things like policing and facial recognition, you start to ask yourself, who are the people who are making these decisions, right? If it's someone who really doesn't understand the communities in which these technologies are going to be used, then maybe everything looks the same, right? Yes, there's a lot of police in this area, so maybe there's more crime. No, how about, police was directed to that area, in order to prevent crime, right? And then it's only making matters worse, right? And so bias also comes in based on the perspectives of the person who is creating. And of course, they're like actual algorithmic biases, right? Like the models themselves are optimizing for success, right? So whatever that requires, right? It's a mathematical function. That also has its biases. And so there's definitely a lot of like ways in which bias can get into, that entire pipeline, from the data generation to the actual person who is exploring or who is creating these models, to the models themselves, even to how you interpret the output, right, of these models. And I think this is where I always talk about representation and how it matters. Representation matters when you're collecting your data. How balanced is your data set? Or, are communities represented, right? Representation matters in the technologies in of themselves, right? My perspectives are very different from from other colleagues, right? And so making sure that people, you have a diverse group of people creating technology is important, right? Representation of other disciplines are also very important, especially as AI starts to move into communities, right? Oftentimes we computer scientists, it's like, yes, we want to use AI to solve all the world's problems, but you're not a social scientist, right? You don't understand social science. You don't really understand how societies work. So making sure you're also having the voices of those people at the table when you're working in a collaborative manner, I think is really important. I could go on and on, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Well, and to layer on that too, the price of houses is one thing but a very real one that gets talked about a lot is the price of insurance.
Oh, yeah.
Is health insurance prices and home insurance prices and car insurance prices. And insurance companies today use machine learning and AI all the time to determine this. And it gets very problematic because there are laws in the US that you can't discriminate based upon race and gender and several other things. I'm not a lawyer. But it gets really problematic because they can't determine based upon those things. But if you look at the coding, you can end up having one thing that signifies as another. So they can't determine based upon race, but they can use zip codes. And zip codes, as we know, often correlate very closely. And you might think, okay, well, if people in this zip code do have a higher accident rate, well, then maybe that's okay. But then when you look back at the training data, and you're like, well, this training data is all biased because this training data has to do with these other things that are happening here, and that's actually not the cause of So there's all these layered and layered problems that come in with how it's being used on a regular basis. So I think it's a as you said, it's a big problem, and it's a big point that I think there are a lot of good people that are working on it, but it still is a significant challenging point. Perhaps, ironically, it's probably the easiest point in the whole structure of making AI to make changes. It's the easiest way. Like there was a really famous study that came out a couple of years ago about facial recognition software and whether or not you see black faces or white faces. And it was made very public by some people from MIT.
Yeah.
And people were like, oh yeah, we need better data sets, and we can get better data sets. We need to train it a little bit better. And they were able to make better changes. And so, but on the realm of the various biases and what's going on, it's a challenge, but it is one that people are working on, which is a positive thing. Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Owen. I'm currently a computer science major here, and I'm enrolled in AI and machine learning currently. So I am kind of like planning in my career to probably work in AI. As like a white male that didn't really grow up in poverty, how can I myself ensure I don't continue, using biased data and all of that? Like, what steps can I take personally from now moving forward to ensure this doesn't continue?
That's a great question. I think first is being aware, right, that you have blind spots. I think there's something really humbling about realizing that your perspective is not the perspective of the person next to you. So one, acknowledging that you have blind spots, but it doesn't just stop there, right? Like being active about enriching your knowledge with educational sources from places outside your sphere of influence, right? Because if we continue in our bubble, you would only continue to be exposed to the stuff that you are exposed to, that you know, right? Right, like, so seeking out diverse perspectives, right? Learning a little bit more about communities. And of course, you don't have to do everything, right? Like, pick a cause that you're passionate about and read up on it, right? Expand, your thinking, your sphere of influence. And then you start to, and then it's easier to understand, empathize, realize like, okay, wait, yes, I do have blind spots. Maybe I don't know it all, right? Like, let me take in this person's perspective. And I think that goes a long way.
I was just going to say find community. Like, it's come to a point now where a lot of times at conferences, you'll have people who are discussing these issues. Just go there and meet people and, engage them there. Perhaps you can continue that relationship. But I think that one of the things if you can avoid being isolated, by all means, find like-minded people that you can at least do some brainstorming with, Yeah.
I mean, I don't really have much to add. I think both Ehi and Elonda hit the nail on the head. I just add, though, it's always tempting to want to center yourself, but it's important to always recognize your own limitations, because we all have limitations, and so not just having other people to listen to, but also recognizing, when you need to step back, right? When you need to let somebody else's voice or perspective be more prominent. That's a difficult task, and it just requires practice and humility.
Questions? These are great questions so far, everyone. Keep it up. This is good.
Hi there. My name is Bridget. I'm a senior here at Duquesne. I'm currently working on a research project that looks at AI-powered suicide prevention and its potential effect on communication. And it's been interesting to find that the intent of this software is like really good, but unfortunately, a lot of studies are telling me that there's a disproportionate flagging of marginalized people groups who aren't shifting their language to match what the AI model deems as acceptable. I guess my question here is, how can your average non-tech savvy user kind of positively contribute to preventing exclusions from happening? Because I think it's important that, every voice should be able to participate. So that's it.
I think it's very hard for people who are not tech savvy to do this. But I think if you understand that your voice is not being included, that's where you begin to start figuring out how to get your voice included. This was this was the interesting story with the automation of Indiana's welfare rolls. It was a total grassroots movement to fight against that. And once people began, not being able to access their medical, Medicare and other benefits, they started organizing. And they started organizing with social workers who had been displaced and getting communities going, and then even confronting the governor of Indiana to change things. So I think that's the best possible solution for most people, is the time-honored strategy of popular organization, because otherwise it's very hard if you don't know how the technology works. Figuring out how to hack it is difficult. But that's another task as well, is how do we educate people about the use of technology? How do we empower people to resist certain tendencies of technology? And of course, the poor, Elonda's kept using this language of survival, which is language I use in my book. Poor are very good at figuring out ways of getting around obstacles. And this is why, of course, the rich want to discourage welfare fraud, because the poor are very good at figuring out how to get what the rich don't want to give them. So this is, people will find ways, and then hopefully they'll be able to share those secrets with other people. But it's always a game of, this is the where I get really cynical. It's always a game of hide and seek, as it were. Those who have strategies to resist are always being hunted down by those who have strategies to find. And so there's going to be a big question about the intentions of those changing things and whether they're being honest about their goals and what they're accomplishing.
I want to venture an answer to that too, because it dwells on some of the things that I've been researching. So in the history of sort of the development of science, in general, the development of science is often like, okay, well, we need scientists to know about ethics in general, but then they have to go off and make their science and do medicine or physics or whatever the hard sciences are. But when you apply this into technology, especially within machine learning and AI, there's a tendency to say, okay, well, what we really need, one way I could answer the question is well, what we really need is machine learning and AI researchers who are socially aware, who have taken a class in sociology, who have also taken a class in ethics, who have also taken a class in philosophy, and have also have a PhD in sociology, whatever it is, right? And that's not a sustainable answer, right? Yes, you do want people that are studying computer science to take a class in ethics. It would be important, right? But we can't make one person have the whole set of human knowledge and all these biases and all the understanding. So I think in terms of the development of technology and machine learning, I think what really needs to happen, especially in things like that, is that there should not be a startup that's trying to make a suicide prevention AI that doesn't have sociologists on the board, that doesn't have people that are experts in this working with them. Because machine learning, especially as what's being used now, the Google Maps one, I don't need a sociologist there necessarily, probably for something, but for the most part, just take me to my destination. But if you're interacting with people on a regular basis, there are all these sciences that people are experts in that I think we don't need to train every new technologist to be an expert in all these things. Owen's going into computer science, we don't need to get him a PhD or a master's of social work to be able to work on something. But if you sat you down and hey, well, I really want to do this, and all of a sudden you have these people around you that can work with you and work with the code and help you develop it, then it becomes this really nice working together. So I think, and this comes up time and time again with the stuff that Natalie was bringing up, with the Compass algorithm, with recidivism rates. There's a necessity of people working together across disciplines that I think is unique in this new technological frame that wasn't nearly as important in a number of developments of science technology over the years that I think that you're bringing to, that I've been thinking a lot in my work. So thank you for that. Oh, we're about out of time. Any final questions here? No, this has been great. Okay, I think it's time for our raffle here, Erzan. Bring them up. Let's do it. Let's do our raffle. Here we go. I don't know. We just got to, it's not big enough for me to reach in. What are we going to do? Just shake him up. Okay, just shake them down, and then each of the speakers is going to grab one.
Just like we'll put everything here.
Yep, there we go. They're just going to grab one and read off the name, and if they're still here, they get it. There we go. So that's good. Yeah, make sure they're all there. This is great. It's a lot of suspense here at the end.
I think we
That
need AI
raffle.
for this.
You would need an AI for this. I think AI could do this pretty well. You need to be able to cut open the bottom of the box is what you need to be able to do here. This is a human problem, as Ren talked about earlier.
This is a genuine black box problem.
Yeah, this is a great black box problem. Oh, there's still one more. Oh
We're
my goodness.
excluding people.
This is great. Okay, there we go. All right. Ehi, you get to draw the first one. You get to do it. Here we go.
Oh my goodness.
Okay, you get to pull the first one.
Cake technology.
Human solutions. No, you get to do it.
Okay.
You're
SCH.
Scott. Tuffish.
Tuffish.
Oh, here we go. All right, Scott. All right. If we call your name, you can come up here afterwards and you can grab a book here. All right, Elonda, you're next.
Oh, that's nice.
Here, I'll grab that. Here we go.
Faina?
Oh, she just left. All right, draw another name. So close. Oh, okay. We have a heart for.
Yeah, we have a
Oh well. Life's hard.
Zoe Nybar?
Hey, all right. Here, wait, I'll take that one. All right, Levi, you gotta draw one. Here we go. We got 3 left, people. We got 3 more. It's exciting.
Julia Menier.
Hey, nice. All right, Elonda, it's back to you. You get to draw another one.
Okay. The suspense of
So much.
Jacob Davis.
Hey, all right, Jacob. All right, Ehi, you get to draw the last one. Here we go.
Emily Curtis.
Hey, there we go. All right. If we called your name, come up after, and we can get one of the books here. Join me in giving the speakers one more round of applause. Thank you so much. And please hang around. There's refreshments afterwards. The speakers will certainly hang around for any questions you have. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to those online for joining us today, too. Thanks so much, everyone.